Good morning and welcome to today's webinar to launch our report called From Measurement of Impact to Learning for Impact, European Charitable Foundations Learning Journeys. This is a report conducted by ESADE Entrepreneurship Institute and supported by the BBK Foundation. My name is Lisa Hienberger. I'm a professor at ESADE. I'm also director of the Entrepreneurship Institute and co-author of this study together with Leonora Buckland and Deborah Gold. We'd like to also thank the 4 foundations who have contributed to this research: Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation in Portugal, Esmée Fairbairn Foundation and Impetus in the UK, and Reach for Change from Sweden. We also interviewed the Rockefeller Foundation, and we'd like to thank everyone for sharing their experience with us. This will be the agenda of the webinar. We'll start with an introduction to the webinar and also introduce the speakers. We'll then move on to discuss impact management by foundations during COVID-19 and also then get into the actual research study, introducing the study, the basic concepts, highlighting some of our findings, and also introduce recommendations and next steps. At the end, we'll have a discussion with representatives of the 4 foundations and also a Q&A with the audience. So if you have any questions during the webinar, you can just ask your questions in the chat and we'll try to address them as soon as we can and as many questions as possible during the Q&A session. So it's really a pleasure for me to introduce the speakers. Very grateful to all of you for being here today. First, I'd like to introduce Nora Sarasola, Director at the BBK Foundation. I'd also like to introduce Veronica Urda, Head of Socioeconomic Impact at BBK, Leonora Buckland, Senior Research and co-author of the study, Luis de Melo Geronimo, Head of the Cohesion and Social Integration Program at the Foundation at the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. Also Elizabeth Paulson, Portfolio Director at Impetus. Gina Crane, Head of Communications and Learning at Esmée Fairbairn Foundation, as well as Richard Gorvet, Global Program and Impact Director at Reach for Change. And of course, we're very grateful to BBK for supporting this research. So I'd like to also ask Nora Sarasola a question. Nora, please, can you speak about why BBK Foundation feels impact management is so important?
Well, hello, good morning. Thank you all for attending this event. Well, for us, we are very pleased to have collaborated with ESADE in preparing this study that provides valuable conclusions for foundations and those of us who work in the field of social transformation, because our aspiration is to maximize the impact of our performance. So that's why we really believe that you cannot improve what you don't measure, and we have this idea in the agenda, and it's very present in all the BBK's activity. So we are committed to the welfare, social cohesion, and economic growth of the territory of Vizcaya for over 1 century, and in this way of trying to improve our performance and trying to maximize this impact, we think that is really important, this kind of generating this kind of knowledge, and also the collaboration with experts to try to improve in this file.
Thank you very much, Nora. And I'd also like to say something about how this research study fits within a broader initiative that we have launched. It's part of the ESADE Entrepreneurship Institute's think tank called the Social Entrepreneurship and Impact Investing Initiative. that aims to achieve impact through teaching, research, and social debate. And please reach out to us if you have any questions about this work. Before going into the results of the study, we'd also like to situate this research within the current crisis that we are all experiencing. We conducted this study before the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'd like to explain a little bit how we think that this study fits within the recent developments. First and foremost, we must recognize the enormous negative impact of COVID-19 on the most vulnerable. Philanthropy has a big role to play in alleviating suffering and supporting innovative solutions going forward. Also, considering diminishing resources and growing problems, we believe that impact management is as important, if not more important, than ever. We have looked at the effect of COVID-19 on impact measurement and management, looking at it in terms of the immediate response, the first 6 months, and also the recovery phase, the recuperation and reconstruction phase of the following 18 months, and what are the effects. So what we see now in recent months is that the use of data, evidence, and facts, it's becoming more important than ever to inform immediate decisions. In terms of the principles of impact management, it's particularly important to take into account stakeholders' needs. So how are stakeholders, what do stakeholders need in terms of the grantees, the beneficiaries, and how can foundations respond very quickly to those needs? There's an emphasis on learning during this rapid response process. However, going forward, we also look at certain potential opportunities and, if you will, sort of positive externalities, if you can even talk about that in terms of COVID-19. One is the opportunity to deepen the focus on systems and collaborate. What we're seeing now is really a lot of examples of foundations and social sector organizations collaborating to solve the most pressing issues. And let's take advantage of that and move forward in a spirit of collaboration. We also see a growing investment in digital infrastructure, and this could also be an opportunity going forward. However, grantees and investees are in need of resources. They need capacity building. And we believe that foundations in philanthropy have a role to play to actually help with this capacity building in these uncertain and challenging environments, and adopting a flexible and collaborative approach. We launched this study in Spanish a month ago, more or less. And following the launch, we asked a few questions to Spanish foundations in terms of impact measurement and management in the COVID-19 context. We'd like to highlight just 3 results of that survey that we conducted. We got responses from 40 Spanish foundations. The first one was, what effect is COVID-19 having on your programs and impact strategy? And we saw that many are reviewing their strategy currently due to COVID-19. And this will also, of course, have consequences on how they measure and manage impact. We also asked the effect of COVID-19 on their impact management process. And we saw that actually very many were reorganizing or reassessing their impact management process, which is also why we think that there's an opportunity, or there's a need as well, for this study. How do you plan to assess the effectiveness of your response to the COVID-19 challenges? We saw that most did not have an impact management strategy for this situation. This is also why we think that we need to work together. So after this introduction, I'd like to hand over to Leonora Buckland.
Hello. So yes, I think now is the time to introduce the research that we did. So today we launched the English language version of the report, and we actually have 3 different reports. We have the full report, which has everything in it. We have an executive summary, which has the highlights and is obviously meant for people who perhaps just want to glean glean those. And then we have a separate report which contains the individual case studies, which we're really very excited by, of the 4 foundations who have joined us today, and you can ask questions to them at the end of this part. So we will send a link in the follow-up email to everyone who registered for the webinar with where you can download those, and there'll also be some information at the end of this research webinar. So why do we think this research is important? Well, we have felt that there has been quite a big gap, particularly in Europe, between a lot of talk and a huge amount of information on impact measurement, impact management, many tools, etc. And then actually the practice of the vast majority of European foundations, who may not yet really be particularly comfortable on this journey. And there is research which suggests that many European foundations find this whole aspect quite challenging, and some are still, for example, only really asking for financial accounting from their grantees. So there is sort of some catching up to do with America. And what we think is interesting, particularly about this research, is that it does offer a case study approach. So it is quite practical. It gets into the nitty-gritty of how this is done, stories of individual foundations. And what is, I think, distinct is obviously it builds on the amazing work that many different organizations have done, which is actually listed in the resources in the report. But it is focused specifically on foundations and their particular set of challenges, and obviously has this more practical case study approach. So now for introducing the stars of our research, and we have 5 foundations that participated in the research, sharing very generously of their time, and I must say very honestly of what has been happening within this field in their foundations. There is no impact washing, I don't think, in this report, and I think that makes it refreshing and very useful. And we're very grateful for them for their honesty in that sense. The first foundation featured here, the Rockefeller Foundation, is really kind of an advisor and a sounding board for the project. We didn't do a full case study of them as they're not obviously in Europe. It's a US-based legacy foundation, but they've been very pioneering in impact management. The second foundation, Reach for Change, funds and supports social entrepreneurs across the world who are working to improve children's lives. It was set up 10 years ago, I think, 2020 is its 10th year anniversary, and we'll hear a bit more about these case studies as we go through the findings. Calouste Gulbenkian is a major Portuguese foundation, and they work in arts, education, science, and social welfare. It's been a pioneer in supporting social investment in Portugal. Impetus is a venture philanthropy foundation. Many of you may know what venture philanthropy is, but in a very simple way, they provide non-financial as well as financial support to a select group of charities, which they fund and support to help disadvantaged youth improve their lives. And finally, Esmée Fairbairn Foundation is a UK-based foundation. It works in the arts as well as with children and young people, the environment and social change. And it also has quite a significant social investment allocation. So those are really the stars of the report. So before going into our findings, I just wanted to really touch on a few very basic concepts and definitions. The first is about what we mean by impact, how we're defining it in this study. We use the impact management project definition, which is a collaborative between funders and investors, etc., in the impact investing space. But their definition is positive or negative changes experienced by people or planet as a result of one or various activities. And I think what's important and what we like about this definition is that it's focused on change. What is the change that you're creating? And it also encompasses both positive and negative changes. And I think this is a sign that the industry as a whole, the impact management world, is moving from this point of sort of proving impact that it's come from to really having a more honest and open appraisal of exactly how one's activities are affecting outcomes both positively and negatively. The other key definition is really between what we mean by impact measurement versus impact management, and they're often referred to all together as IMM, impact management and measurement, or impact measurement and management. So the measurement side we feel is the more technical process of choosing the tools and actually measuring that these changes that we've talked about. And the impact management for us encompasses the softer aspects that are really as important as the technical side, which is what are the systems, the processes, the culture, and the capabilities which are related to impact measurement within the foundation. So I think it's quite a good time, before I go really more deeply into the research, for everyone who's in the webinar to sit back and to really think about why they might want to monitor and measure impact. What is important for them? Why is their organization interested in this? What is driving them? And really welcome for anyone who wants to put their thoughts into the chat on this, and maybe we can pick up on some of those later. I think we just wanted to underline a few ideas here, really. The first and the most obvious is just to understand the difference that's being made. And I think that this is part of the idea of moving beyond, let's say, a more anecdotal approach to understanding impact, which is talking to grantees or beneficiaries, getting some stories, to really perhaps a more rigorous, systematic framework to collect impact data and to understand that difference. The second point is about the fact that as foundations, resources, and everyone knows, are incredibly precious and catalytic and risk-taking and different from other actors who are working to create social change. So we really need to make the most of them and allocate them in the best way. And then finally, I think we very much emphasize in our research that the frame needs to change to really be about learning. Learning as a foundation about what we're doing, how we're doing it, but also learning with everyone we support, with our grantees and investees. So those, I think, are some reasons, but perhaps in the private chat you have some others as well. Sorry, in the chat you have others that you're talking about. So in terms of, I just wanted to stop here and say that, so now we're kind of entering the body of the research findings. We're not able to cover everything in this short space of time, and we really feel it would be really valuable to have time to discuss with the foundations themselves, for you as an audience to be able to ask questions to them. So I'm not going to labour the research findings and go into the detail. Just really encourage you to download, if you can, the report and look at all the detail there. This is really just touching, giving you a taster of what's in there. So the key output really from the report is a framework, which is like a roadmap, and we feel that it will help foundations, really those foundations who are perhaps just starting on this journey, as well as people who are more advanced, just to give some ideas, orientations, and suggestions of what they might be thinking about. And in the report, we have quite a lot more detail about all these themes and sub-themes. So I'll just really briefly touch on the 5 different themes that are here, and then we will go into a few of them and illustrate with some of the case studies. So the first theme, which I think is what everyone really normally thinks about when they think about impact management, is the design of the approach, which is really, about the what, where, when, and how of impact management. And I think this is obviously an essential first step to the whole process. And the second theme is the resourcing and organising for impact management, which is about, you know, having enough money, enough budget to do this, having the right organisational structure. For some foundations, that might be hiring an impact person, using external consultants, having an actual impact team. Obviously, a lot of this depends on the size of the foundation, the amount of resources, etc. And this roadmap is supposed to be a general one which can be used by foundations of all different shapes and sizes, although we understand some might feel, you know, they might be too small or starting on the path. We're happy to kind of talk at the end about how these themes and sub-themes can be adapted for different shapes and sizes of foundations. The third theme is embedding impact management through organisational culture. And I think that really starts to touch on many of these softer aspects that we believe are really critical to actually getting this whole impact management side to work within foundations. So moving away from a more kind of technocratic understanding, a more siloed and compliance-oriented focus, to actually a whole foundation culture which supports an impact mindset. The fourth theme is building internal and external capacity to manage impact. So really this discusses and thinks about what might be the skills internally that we need to manage impact. And actually some of those skills might be changing quite a lot with the data and technology wave, for example, with the need to ensure diversity and inclusion as part of this impact management process. And then also, what do our grantees and investees need? How can we help them? Because ultimately, you know, we're very, very reliant, if we're managing our own impact, on the quality of how our grantees and investees are actually doing this. And the fifth, which I think is really particularly important, as Lisa was saying, in these COVID times, is this whole point about the collaboration, sharing knowledge, being transparent. I think the foundation sector sometimes has had been stereotyped as being quite closed, private, keeping things within the four walls of the foundations. And I think we can learn a lot from what the foundations that we have featured in our report here are doing in terms of collaboration. There are some very interesting and exciting initiatives, and hopefully we can build on that in the future. So I just wanted to touch on the first theme, which is the design of, do a bit of a deep dive into the design of the impact management approach. I won't go into all of the sub-themes, but just pick out a few. The first sub-theme, which is obviously the kind of the basic theme, is really to be clear about impact goals and purpose for the foundation. This sounds quite self-evident, but I think, as the panelists might attest to, actually getting that clarity internally, which would encompass the board of the foundation staff, and the senior management team, etc., around kind of a shared vision of what is the impact we want to achieve and how, is actually quite a task sometimes, depending obviously on the size and the sort of fragmentation of the foundation. And there are tools to help with this, like the theory of change, which we'll talk about. Allied to this sub-theme is the fourth one here, which is the determining the level of impact. Because I think particularly for large foundations, which may be funding across different sectors, it can be a challenge to move beyond, let's say, a siloed programmatic approach to monitoring and evaluation, and to really understand at a holistic foundation-wide level, what is the impact that we're creating. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about the third sub-theme, which is engaging with stakeholders. This, I think, is very critical. It's a big trend in philanthropy, which is to really move from this sort of top-down approach to becoming more partners with those that we're supporting. And I think involving our grantees, investees in this whole process upfront really is very helpful. And sorry, I just wanted to talk a little bit about choosing the social impact measurement tools, because I think when people think about impact measurement and management, often this is what they focus on. So which tools we should use, and obviously it's very important. But I think you can see here it's sort of one sub-theme among many. What we see from the foundations that in these case studies is that there is no standardized approach at the moment in terms of the choosing of the social impact measurement tools. I think foundations are still very much customizing and developing their own different ways of managing impact. And I think it can be quite overwhelming for foundations at the beginning to try and work out, which tool they're going to use. Is it SROI? Is it theory of change? Is it? And I suppose that the journeys, the foundations we've been on, we've studied, have illustrated is that it's really a question of reiterating, choosing something and learning and going step by step, that there isn't sort of a right tool or a right answer here. So talking about the theory of change, I just wanted to mention Reach for Change, which is the Swedish foundation I was discussing, supporting social entrepreneurs. A theory of change is a tool that you probably know well, many of you, and it tracks an organization's path from activities to outputs and impact, describing the change that the organization wants to make and the steps, and then trying to link and further refine and validate these links between the different steps. And it's quite useful, as you can see here, because it's very visual, it's immediate, and it graphically maps out what you're trying to do and how. This is Reach for Change, as I mentioned, who support social entrepreneurs across many different countries. And this theory of change shows that in 2018, they incubated 156 social ventures, which in turn supported over 340,000 children and youth. And in terms of what they define as short-term outcomes, 75% of social ventures reached their targeted development milestones for the foundation. And I'll talk a little bit in the next slide about what that means. And then in terms of longer-term outcomes that they're tracking, an example is 91% of their alumni still in business, and 70% have continued to grow. So in order to obtain the information to populate this theory of change, Reach for Change uses a variety of customized tools, one of which is the development tracker, which I show here. And that maps each of the social ventures, does a sort of a pre and a post on different characteristics. So one is the effectiveness of the solution, financial sustainability, which is shown B here, C, leadership and team, D, impact scaling, and E, systems change. So I think you can see here that the dark blue line is where the target is for the social ventures that are being supported. The pink line was where those social ventures were at the beginning of the year in 2018, and the light blue line was where they were at the end of the year in 2018. So this is sort of monitoring the development of each of the social ventures and aggregating them across these different characteristics. Reach for Change also conducts feedback, which I think Richard Gorvet, we're very lucky to have here, can talk a little bit about, if that's possible, of all of their social ventures. So one of the really important things is to sort of get grantee investee feedback about the foundation. How are we doing, and what is our contribution to the change? Next, I just wanted to briefly introduce Impetus and their work in terms of performance management and impact management. I think one of the most impressive things about Impetus is that it is trying to understand not only how it's impacting on the charities that it supports, but how they are impacting on a whole sector. and then it's mapping Impetus's influence on the sector. And this dashboard that you see here is one tool of different tools that they used to look at how they are influencing the sector, which is disadvantaged youth. So they collect a lot of macro level data around education and employment, for example. They will commission research to really understand these different outcomes, to map how disadvantaged young people are doing, and then to sort of really understand, well, what are the major sectoral issues, and how can Impetus really try and influence and help those particular issues. They also speak a lot to their charities to understand the voice of the charities, which I think is also really important. So yes, I have a quote here from Impetus, which is, taking a sector-wide view has been helpful to focus on the cumulative effect of our investments and how we can make the biggest possible difference. And then finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Rockefeller Foundation, which is particularly active right now in trying to understand how to bring impact investment approaches and teams together with, let's say, the more traditional grant making teams within foundations, to try and synthesize and maybe merge a little bit some of the impact management approaches. I think quite a few foundations across Europe are starting to think about or are experimenting with social impact in investment. So really thinking about how do we learn from each other here. The impact investing side and the more, let's say, traditional evaluation side is really important, and Rockefeller is very advanced in thinking about this. They've written publications and done quite a lot of research, and that's included in the study. So let's move on to another theme, which is the third theme, which is really the one about organizational culture. So how do we ensure that that the board and the C-level are really behind this? How do we get the whole foundation more oriented to an impact mindset? How do we, let's say, change our approach to working with grantees and investees, and it's to become more about shared learning? And can we aspire to become a learning organization? So I've chosen to talk about Esmée Fairbairn and Calouste Gulbenkian in this perspective, in this theme, because both were very pioneering in terms of trying to break some of these silos that might exist between programs and create more of a kind of general impact mindset in the organization. In both cases, this was triggered and led really by the head of the foundation. I think that they both believed is really key to how this has worked. There was resistance by some foundation staff, I think perhaps a little bit of skepticism towards whether this was really going to be a good use of time, creates a bit of an additional workload in some cases to track and track impact in a different way. But I think they've been brought on board into the process, and that's been very helpful, and they have found it inspiring and understood that actually it's really helping. It will help people's lives on the ground. So that's been their way of overcoming, in a way, this staff skepticism. I think for Esmée Fairbairn, what is really impressive is this amazing focus on learning. Gina Crane, who's with us, her title is Head of Communications and Learning, and I think that they've really restructured and revamped their process to really orientate towards learning, to want to learn as much about what they're doing as actually allocating the resources themselves. So that's quite inspiring. Finally, just wanted to touch on the final theme, which is so important right now, which is collaborating, sharing knowledge, and being transparent to support impact management, which is about developing initiatives across the foundation sector, but also with public sector, private sector, actors and thinking more in this system approach, actually talking to each other more, having more peer exchange. And then the question mark is, can we use this data opportunity that Lisa mentioned, that COVID has created, this digital infrastructure building opportunity, but also the whole data and technology wave, which we were seeing coming before, and might be a game changer in terms of our ability to manage impact. So in this sense, there are quite a lot of open source databases emerging in Europe, which, for example, the 360 Giving, which you see on the slide, is a tool based in the UK, which makes it possible to see and compare grants awarded by different funders. That's central and local government, charitable foundations, and community and corporate foundations. Then One Value is a tool in Portugal which gathers and systematizes information about public investment. So we are seeing some of these open source databases emerging. I think in America there's perhaps more going on in that respect, and that we can perhaps aspire to move even more, share more data, share all of our impact evaluations, really embrace this open source culture there around impact management. Collaborations, all of the foundations that are listed here have collaborated with different foundations and across different sectors, which is hugely important, and have been very proactive in sharing their knowledge of what they've been doing around impact and other areas. So I'm just bringing this part of the webinar to a close. I won't go into all of the recommendations because I think it's more interesting and important to speak to the panelists, etc. But I'll just touch on a few kind of conclusions which we might have for individual foundations. The first is that impact management is a long-term change process. This takes time, commitment, and it requires a sort of a holistic foundation-wide approach. But that shouldn't be to deter people and foundations from starting on the journey if you haven't already. You can learn from these examples. There are many more examples as well, and so many interesting case studies. And ESADE really wants to continue over the next few years to be collecting those stories and sharing those stories. Many publications and initiatives out there as well. So much going on in this field. So I think it's a really brilliant time to sort of to be on this journey. But this is a process of exploration and adaptation. And I think particularly in these COVID times, we're all really called, particularly around this point of collaboration and sharing. And for the sector, I think at a basic level, we just need to continue to raise awareness about this and help disseminate best practices, maybe create more opportunities for this kind of peer learning and involvement of different actors, whether that be the evaluation community and charitable foundations to meet. And there needs to be a little bit of a reframing of the language around impact management to really encompass this point about learning, which we have probably rather driven home in this webinar, and I think is a really kind of key message that we want to get across with the study. And there are obviously more opportunities that we need to create for capacity building around all of this. So without further ado, I wanted to hand back over to Lisa, who I think will talk a little bit about the next steps of the research. Thank you very much for listening, and yeah, just again to encourage you to actually go into the full research.
Thank you so much, Leonora, for presenting the study. And it's now my pleasure to speak a little bit about next steps. So I'm very excited now to announce that we're launching a community of practice on impact measurement and management for European foundations. I'll explain a little bit what we mean by that, and then I'll ask Veronica Urda a few questions. Veronica is head of socioeconomic impact at BBK Foundation. Next slide, please. So what is a community of practice, and why do we need that? A community of practice is really where members are sharing a common concern, set of problems, or interest in a topic, and they learn together in a social and collaborative way, discuss common problems, and develop dynamic solutions. And the emphasis here is on practice rather than theory, and it's something that is co-created between the participants, while also including latest trends and cutting-edge knowledge. So what are the objectives of this particular community of practice? We'd like the community of practice to cultivate transparency, knowledge sharing, and peer exchange on the subject of impact measurement and management. And we'll also like to create a safe space where foundations can share their struggles, concerns, or even failures and speak openly about this. And we think that this could lead to and facilitate collaboration between foundations, but also ultimately move the European foundation sector forward through dialogue and the outputs of this community. How will this work? And this is just a brief explanation, but we'd like this to be very much a co-creation process where the participating foundations are the key actors. And the foundations should determine their own content and topics for discussion, and really drive the development of the community of practice in a participant-led and co-creative process. The role of ESADE Entrepreneurship Institute here, with the support of BBK, is to provide infrastructure and support team to guide and nurture the community of practice, also be, in a way, curator of content, and put the community together and make sure that people do feel safe and free to share, and also, of course, to produce certain outputs. And we do see this as a collaboration, and we are very grateful to count on the support of EVPA and the Association of Spanish Foundations in terms of networks that are already on board, because we believe that it's important to collaborate, to exchange knowledge, align, and co-disseminate the content that we're creating. We also will call on field experts to share and to contribute to the community of practice, and also to ensure that there's a dialogue between the more specialized impact or evaluation community and the foundations that are included in the community of practice. We also, of course, want to include the voice of the beneficiaries and the grantees. I think from Leonora's presentation, it's very clear that this is a key part of impact management. So beneficiaries and grantees their voices will be heard and they will be consulted with. What do we think would be the benefits of this community of practice? So for the participating foundations, as Leonora was saying, the emphasis really is on learning. So we believe that the participating foundations can really increase their individual and institutional capital in terms of knowledge, also social capital through new or renewed relationships and connections, and also ultimately a reputational capital. And obviously, we also think that by doing this learning, the practices in foundations can improve, so that we will see positive changes and innovations within foundations' actions, practices, approaches, and systems concerning impact measurement and management. We don't want the knowledge to stay within the community of practice. The community of practice is a tool to create the knowledge. And we do think that it's important to actually share all of this knowledge with the sector, and so that society also benefits. So what we'll do together with BBK is to actively disseminate and share the knowledge created so that the entire foundation sector can benefit. Next. So at this point, I'd like to ask a few questions to Veronica. Veronica Urda is head of socioeconomic impact at BBK Foundation. And so first, I'd like to ask you, first of all, thank you for your support and collaboration. And so I'd like to ask this question. BBK is generously supporting this community of practice. Why do you think it's an important initiative?
Good morning, and thank you for your question, Lisa. We are also very excited about this new project we are now designing together. Back to the question. Well, for BBK, this is an important initiative because we've seen that it is increasingly common for organizations to dedicate time and resources to measuring and communicating the social impact that we generate through our activity. It's an important element both externally and internally, because it responds to an increasingly conscious and demanding society which wants to know how the activities of an organization affect their environment and stakeholders. And this makes it necessary to evaluate and communicate their contribution. In addition, maximizing the impact of our activity is one of our main goals, reinforcing our commitment to do more and get more with the resources we have. Through impact management, organizations can learn and improve their performance. They can enhance the activities that generate the most impact, redefine or redirect those that are not achieving the expected results, or prioritize projects based on measurable results. And this has been one of the main reasons to support this initiative. Impact measurement is a key element for the responsible management of companies and organizations that work to generate positive and sustainable changes.
Thank you, Veronica. I also wanted to ask you what you find most helpful and important in the study, and also how the community of practice fits within your foundation's vision and general perspective of philanthropy and the role that you play in the foundation sector.
Well, at BBK, we have been working for more than 5 years on measuring the impact of our activity and defining and adapting our evaluation model. As you know, there is a wide range of methodologies and instruments that each organization incorporates in its processes in a particular way, designing customized solutions to measure their impact. In this context, we found it interesting to know how the main foundations were addressing this challenge. It was a surprise to find such a high willingness to share these experiences and to identify difficulties and concerns that were common to all of them. This was the origin of the idea of creating a community of practice in which different foundations with different activities and impact models would share their experiences, success stories, what worked and what did not on their journey to impact measurement. The great experience of working with you with the study and the valuable conclusions that we obtained with the study encourage us to continue to shape this idea into the community of practice that we present to you today. For BBK, this community is an opportunity to continue spreading impact management through the generation and dissemination of knowledge on this field. We are convinced that every organization aspires to maximize the impact it generates and to use its resources in the most effective and efficient way possible. And for this, the learning provided by impact measurement is fundamental. On this path to learning, collaboration between foundations takes on a special relevance. We really hope that you find this community of practice as helpful and interesting as we do. Thank you all for sharing with us this day. And also thanks to ESADE and the foundations participating in the study for their dedication and effort to achieve these rich findings.
Thank you very much, Veronica. So I'm going to hand back to Leonora again.
Great. So now we're going to move on to about 20 minutes or so of facilitated discussion. In the meantime, I'd really encourage anyone who has questions to post them, because Lisa will be collecting and filtering questions, and then we'll have a good 20 minutes at the end to answer the audience questions. So in terms of this discussion, we've got the panelists very luckily with us who contributed to the research, which is Lisa introduced at the beginning, Luis De Geronimo from the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, Elizabeth Paulson from Impetus, Gina Crane from Esmée Fairbairn, and Richard Gorvet from Reach for Change. So I think Lisa mentioned that obviously that COVID is potentially quite disruptive in terms of impact measurement and management. So I just wanted to start by asking you, and I'll start with Gina, if you could just tell us a little bit about how you have responded to COVID, and particularly how that's been affecting your impact measurement and management practice.
Sure. Good morning. I'm really proud of the way that Esmée has responded to the COVID crisis, and we have changed quite a lot about the way that we support the organisations that we fund, and we've also given out lots of extra money. So on the reporting impact management front, we have basically relaxed all of our reporting restrictions. We've released payments without getting any reports. We've made grants. We've sort of released all the restrictions on grants, so we've made them completely unrestricted. And we've given out 545 fast response grants, which represent 6 months of our existing grants to organisations we already fund. And that's been for about £14 million. That's on top of our regular budget. So that's out of our endowment, we will give that. And I hope that that won't be the last thing we'll do, because I'm sure it won't be the last thing that the sectors that we support need. We haven't asked for any applications for that funding, and we haven't asked for any reporting. So like that kind of section of the Spanish responders, we've changed our plans, and we need to work out how we learn from those grants. We absolutely will learn from them, but I think what we won't do is ask for written reports. What we will do is manage facilitated conversations, perhaps for organisations together with each other, so that they can learn about what happened. And we're also learning from other people. So we are absolutely not learning from our grantees through reports is not the only way we can learn. In the Institute for Voluntary Action Research in the UK have set up an amazing set of facilitated conversations with chief executives of charities, where they talk about week by week the things that they are doing to help during the coronavirus crisis, and the things that they are most worried about, and most crucially for funders, recommendations of what funders can do to support them. And those briefings, they came out weekly at the beginning. They're now coming out twice weekly, and they are absolutely invaluable for us, because we are changing our strategy right now, and we need the learning right now. And why should we get it? Why should we ask organisations to provide it just for us? Much better that we share it.
Great, Gina. That's wonderful. I didn't know about the IVAR briefing, so that's really exciting example of collaboration and coming together really to face COVID as a sector. So great. And Richard, can you talk a little bit about Reach for Change and how maybe it's adapting and evolving in terms of its IMM and programs in the face of COVID?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Leonora. Yeah, it's interesting because our IMM hasn't really changed much at all. I think the nature of our programming is very sort of non-financial support heavy anyway. And as far as we've been able to, we've tried to make our sort of impact tracking systems as learning friendly for the investee organizations as possible. So we have a portfolio of around 100 social entrepreneurs across multiple countries, as you mentioned. And they actually report to us on a triannual basis every 4 months, and they send us data, and then we sit down with them and look at the data and discuss sort of performance, but it's more around needs and support needs, so that the support plans that we have can be adjusted and updated for the coming 3 or 4 months. So when all this started, we were reaching out to other organizations to see what everybody was doing, and there was a lot of discussion of suspending reporting requirements, and we agreed that the last thing people would need would be to feel pressured into reporting when they're sort of in crisis management mode. So we considered, should we just stop it, or should we offer to stop it? So we made it a possibility for the social entrepreneurs not to do the reporting at the end of April if they felt too much other pressure. Really interestingly, only one of the 100-odd organizations actually didn't report, which we were quite shocked by. And I think, again, I mean, it's a little bit testament, I hope, to the way that we've set things up, because actually sort of providing that data to facilitate the conversation with the program managers around what they were going through and what they needed was actually kind of in their interest, and it was good to see that. It was kind of it was an endorsement, I think, a little bit of how we set things up, so that was quite pleasing. We did obviously talk to the entrepreneurs about what they needed to adjust our programming in terms of the support that we were providing, and one of the outputs of that was a kind of COVID survival toolkit that we put together with our partners at Bain, and we will be doing some impact measurement follow up on that, just in terms of how effective that's been over the coming months. But really, that's the only adjustment that we've needed to make.
Okay, so yeah, there's quite a range of experience in terms of how much one is having to sort of shift strategies in the face of COVID. Elizabeth, what's happening with Impetus? Is there a big strategic shift, and how's that affecting IMM?
Sure. Hi, Leonora. Hi, Lisa, and thanks so much for inviting me and inviting us to participate. Congratulations on the report. For us, I guess maybe two ways to think about it. One, first, directly with the charities. Obviously, with many of them, we've developed or helped them develop their capacity to manage their own impact as a kind of integral part of their business strategy. I think where that came and became really useful in this crisis is when we were supporting them to look at their scenario planning and how they might need to adapt their business plans. It meant that they had a really clear lever of the kind of cost and impact trade-offs that they might have to make in terms of initial adjustments, and of course, going forward, what those levers would look like for their business strategies. So for example, if they know their program needs X amount of hours a day to deliver certain outcomes for a certain type of young person, if they had to cut certain hours, what would that mean for their impact? So it gave them really great clarity on how to make those choices. And I think for us as an organization, it was really interesting because our non-financial support that we use to help the organizations build their performance capacity has shifted quite a bit. If you can imagine over the last couple of months, we've had to put a lot more intense support around our own work in public affairs, how we're working with government to make sure money is streaming, hopefully, toward effective support for young people. And that's worked really, really well. It meant we might have done less work on supporting leadership development, government, or senior teams, and much more on the financial sustainability lens. And to that end, we've been working with government around the online tutoring pilot. So we're part of the core group that's going to be delivering that over the summer to help young people catch up. We're also part of the team, along with EEF and Sutton and Nesta, that will be looking at the major government package at scaling up tutoring over the next few years for young people also who fell behind during the crisis. So it's interesting that we pivoted our non-financial support quite a lot just to respond to what was available and what was changing in the market.
But in terms of how you're assessing the value of that non-financial support, you sort of already have the same, that your customer toolbox, so you don't need to change that too much.
Exactly. And I mean, to be honest about that, of course, what that's showing us is, of course, organizations are having to slow down some of the elements of capacity they were developing while they pivot and adjust to other things. But given that we've got sort of this framework that stays relatively fixed, it obviously allows us to see what they're dialing up and down, and then maybe hopefully support them appropriately. So they might be dialing down on governance reviews, but obviously dialing up on thinking around program adaptation or accessing new government pots of money and how we can support them to do that.
So in fact, what I'm hearing from you all is that all the work and the investment that you've made into kind of establishing the frameworks, as well as the collaborations and conversations, is really a huge opportunity, and you're very grateful for all that upfront work you did, because it's helping you to manage this crisis better than you might have done otherwise if you hadn't prioritized all that work before. So I think that's really sort of an interesting thing. And Louise, for Calouste Gulbenkian, I know that you're in the midst of a re-evaluation of impact management, and I know you've launched an emergency fund, etc. Sort of what's happening within the foundation. Could you just give us a few highlights?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate, and congratulations for the report. It's always good to have the chance also to reflect ourselves and to learn with the others, and we are here with amazing foundations. So really grateful. So I think, like everyone, we were caught by surprise with all the COVID crisis, and we felt that we really need to move in a different way, meaning being much more efficient and faster. So we set up this emergency fund, a 5 million euros fund, to work in all the areas that the foundation is working on art, science, education, and also to robust the civil society. But we have done it in a different way. Sometimes foundations take 1 year and a half to make strategic reviews, or some options for new areas. Those options had to be made like in weeks and or even days, and all this was put up and running in 2 weeks, and all the money was deployed in less than 1 month, which comparing with our traditional approach, it's a pace that we have never lived. We have done it like 2 things. One was to make sure to all the grantees that the foundation was supporting, that they would be continued supporting, like Gina mentioned, with no reporting needed, just like to make sure that they will be able to continue working, even though some of the initiatives may not like accomplish their result or results, or sometimes like stopped for a while because of the crisis. And then we pick up like some areas that were like more fragile, where we felt we could add some value, particularly on cultural organizations and artists. Also to robust the response of organizations that were supporting elderly people at home, and in a more innovative way, like to deploy some money also to develop some digital solutions that could best meet this crisis. But the learnings here is there was like, I have never seen like a collaboration wave internally. The foundation is quite big. We have more than 500 people working here, and I've never seen so much internal collaboration. And this is like a learning when we have really a common purpose, and people feel that purpose. They work like in a pace that they don't work usually. Also to make some like questioning, like our traditional assumptions and procedures. Do we really need like endless reportings? Can we like, or endless calls or forms for applications? So really pushing our procedures to be as lean as possible, because at the end of the day, our success is the success of the initiatives that we fund, and the impact is there. And I think a big lesson of the COVID crisis, at least here, and I think other foundations are also feeling that now more than ever, we feel how privileged the position of the foundations are, and we really need to make that sort of humbleness exercise to recognize that the heroes are not like the foundations. The heroes are the organizations that we support, and we need to ask them what they best need in order to fulfill that mission. So taking like the foundations from like the center, where like all the organizations gravitate, but actually putting that like as really a server for the organizations that are really making an impact in people's life at every day. And we are privileged to have the resource and means to robust the organizational capacity and capabilities, but they know much better than we do what works and what doesn't work, and that sort of humbleness is something really important, and I think it really came out from this crisis.
Yeah, great. It's nice to sort of some silver linings there maybe for the sector, and I think your point about humility and taking foundations out of the center is hugely important, and actually has a lot to speak to in terms of the sort of IMM, which I think has sometimes been quite oppressive for grantees and investees, and anxiety creating as a process. So I mean, Gina, I just wanted to ask, because I know that there might be some foundations that maybe are not as big as you know, as you or the Gulbenkian, and you know, asking, well, you know, how do we start this? How do we decide which of these X many social measurement tools we might use? Could you know, maybe offer a little bit of advice or thought on how to start really on the approach?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of guidance in the report, so absolutely that's a good place to start. But I wanted to just run through a few questions that we ask ourselves pretty regularly. So the approach that is in the report and the case study is our approach that we have been using for the last few years, we are revising that right now, and we are thinking about what we will do going forward. And I think one thing to kind of bear in mind is really, whatever you choose, you can change it, and you should bear in mind that you will want to change it. You will change your strategy, and so you'll have to think about how you think about measuring or assessing your impact. So first of all, ask yourself why. First, consider why we want to learn about our impact anyway. What are we going to do with what we learn? What are we willing to and able to change as a result of what we learn? There are lots of different purposes for learning. Is it for accountability, to know something's been done, for demonstrating your impact, whether that's for influencing others or for fundraising purposes? Some foundations are doing that. Or is it for your own strategy? Is it to make changes based on your progress, to understand what you've been doing and how to learn about that? Next, I guess you've thought about why, think about what. So map out what we need to know, then try to really simplify it. We recently mapped out all our questions at every level, our beneficiaries, the charities that we support, our staff, and our trustee board. And in the end, they all boiled down to 2 questions, which were, what does the world look like for the people, organisations and issues we support? And where are we making most progress and why? And I found that really helpful. The next 2 questions, once you've thought about your learning questions, are how are you going to do it and who is going to do it? So consider how you could answer these questions and who's going to do the work needed to collect the data. And if it isn't us, a rich foundation, are we paying the organisations that we fund to gather that for us? Because we should be. A few tips to end on just, I would consider your impact on organisations, not just through them. Do gather feedback and act on it. Fit form to function. Don't collect complex data or design a complex system if it's not what's really needed. And most importantly, use what's already being produced. There's so much data and information being produced by all of the organisations you support. Think about how you can use that instead of asking for new stuff.
Okay, great. Thanks, Gina. That's really helpful. I think I love those 2 questions you came up with there, and the fact that you frame it as a learning rather than as a measurement objective. So that's really interesting. Richard, just on this whole issue of aggregating impact, we talked about your theory of change, and that's from 2018. I know you have a more recent one now, but how important do you think that whole area is of really trying to aggregate impact up to the foundation-wide level?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a little bit on the foundation, I guess. I can speak to Reach for Change and how we find aggregation useful. But I think, ultimately, of course, what we're trying to do is understand the extent to which we're achieving our vision, our mission, and our intended impact goals. And I think, if as a foundation, if your impact goals are aggregatable, if that makes sense, then it makes sense to aggregate. And if you have maybe a broader set of different impact goals, maybe it's harder to aggregate, or doesn't make quite so much sense to aggregate. But I think, of course, being able to aggregate is important in terms of, or where possible is important, because for learning and for communication, for understanding purposes. So I think when you mentioned earlier, Reach for Change, we're kind of 10 years old now. And when we started out 10 years ago, our original impact goal was really to build a global movement of social entrepreneurs building a better world for as many children as possible. It was quite a kind of idealistic, simple sort of start point. But in terms of impact outcomes, the goal was very deliberately agnostic. So we actually wanted the local social entrepreneurs in all the different markets where we were working to tell us what the most pressing issues were in their communities, and then we'd support whichever of the social entrepreneurs where we felt we had the potential, or that we thought they had the potential to create the most impact. So when you're doing that with hundreds of organizations working on different issues across 18 very different countries, it doesn't really make sense, and it's not really that possible to aggregate their impact outcomes. But what did make sense for us was to aggregate other things. So one of the key things was the extent to which the organizations were developing as a result of our support programs. So we built a common development framework called the Development Tracker that you mentioned earlier, which enabled us to see both at individual organizational level, but also at aggregated levels, how well each of the portfolio organizations and how the portfolios as a whole were developing. And we could look at that at a country level or a regional level or a global level. and that then helps, from a learning perspective, helps us to sort of identify where strengths and weaknesses are in our program, again at local, regional or global levels. And maybe we have a weakness over here in one market, which is a strength in another market. So it helps us to pick what's working here and apply it elsewhere, which has been really helpful. Looking ahead, we're actually changing the strategy, like a lot of people, but we're putting together a strategy to take us through toward 2030. And we will actually be having more of a thematic focus in the new strategy. So we're actually looking at some more specific aggregatable kind of impact outcomes across the 3 themes that we'll be working. I think frameworks like the SDGs and things like really help with that. So we're making that shift at the moment.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for that. And I know that we've got people really wanting to ask their questions. So we'll wrap up in a few minutes. Just 2 quick questions. One to Elizabeth, which is, what do you feel the big challenges, as it were, for foundations and impact management going forward? I'll start with that one. Yeah. So if you could just let us know briefly what you think those challenges are. Elizabeth? Hello? Can't hear me. We can't hear Elizabeth.
I just unmuted myself.
Okay, sorry.
That's all right. No, I was going to say, Leonor, I'll try to keep it short. I was trying to think if I were to leave with one theme around this, and I think the biggest challenge is actually getting comfortable with failure. And what I mean by, I guess, when we think about impact measurement and management, there are a lot of amazing things that it delivers. It helps with social investment and performance-based funding and monitoring and tracking the impact of your work. But ultimately, I guess in our view, at Impetus, it's that over time, it's understanding clearly what you're succeeding at, where you're failing, and over time, failing less. And that applies to our charity partners and social enterprises. How do they learn to use that live, iterative tool of impact management to make sure that over time, the specific group of people they're working with are getting to the outcomes they want, and that number is increasing over time? For us, it means, how do we make sure the support, the non-financial support to the charities in our portfolio works? And when we don't succeed with the charity, why? Was it the wrong partner? Was our support delivered poorly? Was it the wrong support? So I guess to me, and we've made changes on that. We realized a few years ago that our organizations were getting stuck at financial scale up. The market was such that we could build these wonderful evidence-based organizations, but they couldn't tap in. So we had to start building a public affairs approach to unlock that, because we couldn't help them. There was a roadblock at some point to the effective scale up of these amazing interventions. So to me, I guess a big goal would be to really be open and comfortable with failure, but to understand that impact management is that tool to reduce failure over time. And when you do that, it makes it not a technical exercise. It's not data. It's human beings. It's the social change you want to see, and getting better little by little, day after day, month after month, year after year. And that's where the heart and soul of this practice comes in. Data helps you do that, but it's all about making that change and over time getting better at it.
Wow, that was very, very, very nicely said. Yeah, couldn't agree more there. And Louise, I know that you, as Calouste Gulbenkian, have been very active in terms of collaborations, Unite Us in Europe, etc. I just wondered, do you feel that, just to end on this, do you feel that this collaboration wave you were talking about internally, but also that you're seeing externally, do you think that's really here to last, or do you think it was sort of an emergency response, and then people are going to kind of go back to business as usual and not necessarily use this opportunity that's been created? Sorry, Louise, I think maybe you're on mute as well.
Okay. To be honest, I really don't know, but I really hope that this collaboration wave is not a hype and just to be like okay in the picture, but actually something that lasts. And this is really a unique opportunity for us to stand up for all that we are praising about, like the potential of collaboration, actually to face collectively some challenges that we know that by ourselves we cannot tackle it, because more and more like the challenges that we are facing, and some of the challenges are new. Some of the challenges, unfortunately, are not new, but I think 2020 is being really a weird year, and it's not all about COVID. You know, there are other issues that are coming up, and sometimes we are now always thinking about COVID, but you know, things that came up this year, like racism, diversity, is something that we really need to make a really a critical exercise about the positioning of the foundations internally and externally. And if it is not like via collaboration, I really don't know how can we best meet the expectations that we have in order to achieve the impact that we want. And there are some good examples. EVPA is doing really a good effort on that. It's conveying a group of foundations like since last year that is now during this year focused on like this survival and revival after this 2020 crisis. You mentioned Unitas. I think it's really also a good example of how different umbrella organizations working with foundations and the impact space can collaborate in a more effective way. But sometimes it's not just collaborate for the sake of collaborating. It's actually how can we turn these communities into task force with a common mission, and that's and that is it, I believe.
Great. Thank you so much, Luis. Lisa, shall I hand over to you now to put forward a few of the audience questions?
Yes, thank you, Leonora, and thanks to the panelists. I think this has been amazing. I've been looking at some of the questions from the audience, and there seems to be a bit of a theme in terms of how do you actually deal with the current emergency and sort of more short-term initiatives versus kind of more long-term strategy, and how does that also then relate to impact measurement? So there was a question from Artem Gordev who asked, what is the main focus? Do you now focus more on countries with a lot of COVID cases, or do you then focus on other countries? I think maybe for your particular foundations, it's not that pertinent, that question, but maybe we can reframe it more in terms of the issues themselves, so that the issues that are more pressing, in terms of COVID versus kind of the long-term challenges that you have been looking at for a long time, in the foundation. So how are you kind of managing that trade-off? Perhaps in terms of the resources that you invest and your strategy, but also in terms of how you measure that. It's maybe a little bit of a difficult question, so anyone who wants to volunteer and jump in.
Okay. Maybe I can give a start. I think it depends on how we frame COVID. If it is a response, like a health response to the COVID crisis, or if it is a response to the COVID effects on the different sectors. In our case, the emergency fund was a way to tackle COVID per se. But now what we are doing is sort of reshaping our strategy, trying to be like as flexible as possible to respond to the COVID effects. And that doesn't mean necessarily to do different things. And I think COVID also give us an opportunity to speed up some of the agendas that we were working on. If we think about like what happened in terms of like digital transformation in the last few weeks, and for instance, the impact on education, in work, in the last weeks we have done like leapfrogs of decades, and that can also work in the areas that we were working. For instance, on trying to accelerate, for instance, this impact investing agenda in a time that more and more the resources from the public sector are at stress. Maybe this is a way or a fast track to promote outcome-based commissioning services. That is something that we are working on for the last years with some promising but not like systematic results. Maybe this is a way to put forward this agenda, and that's a part of the response. The other part, I think, in terms of what does it mean for like impact management, I think we really need to be more and more responsible about the data that we ask and collect, and really always making the question, what does this mean for me, but also what this data mean for the organizations that we are supporting. And if this impact management is not like a learning process for the organization, maybe it's something that we need to do differently, because more and more we really need to be responsible in the way we manage the time that the organizations devote to this sort of tools, and making sure that we reinforce them and not like force them to make what we want. And that's it. I think the other trend that I recognize here, and that is something that we are trying to push. We have done in some cases, but now it's becoming more of a trend. I know, for instance, Fairbairn has done that beautifully with that sort of like grant letters that in a day were signed for 500 organizations, I believe, as core support. And more like core support will be critical for the revival of the sector, and we really need to get rid of those assumptions of overheads and project-based funding to a more long-term impact-driven funding. And maybe that means like funding less organizations, because the resources are not like infinite, but funding better, and that's our responsibility, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. That's very good advice, I think, to the foundation sector. And I'm sure maybe some of the other panelists have something to add to that, but I just wanted to also include a question here from Braulio Pareja, who's asking about metrics and the issue that we sometimes have, that metrics are easy to use when it's a short-term output, short-term effect, but it's much more difficult to find adequate metrics for long-term impact. And perhaps this might also be a sort of give you a kind of a perverse incentive to focus more on the short term and what's easy to measure. It's actually a question for Leonora and myself, but I think that probably from your experience in the foundations, you have something to say about this as well.
I might, could I add one thing, Lisa, I would say? I know at the beginning you set up about a definition of impact, and I think one thing we add to that definition is that it's durable, so it's sustained. So, if you catch up reading over the summer, but then you lose it 1 month in, all that work came to nothing. So almost all of our organizations and ourselves, I suppose, always assume in their own kind of impact strategy or theory of change that it's not just what happens when that person leaves their program or leaves the door, but actually is that sustained? And so a part of their program has to incorporate an element of that follow-up. Otherwise, they just don't know, and they have to assume, going back to my failure success, they have to assume it didn't work. If they don't have the data to tell them it did work, they have to assume it didn't. And so for a lot of them, getting an understanding of what that long-term metric is, I think I would just add that for many of them, they look to see where it's something that's trackable, not too onerous. And obviously, I think going into some of those other questions in the chat, where there's also existing data that captures that same data by the government or across the sector, then you actually have some comparability. So sometimes it's worth it to bend a little bit to be able to have other numbers that then you can compare because they're captured and you can compare in baseline. So we see that with youth unemployment. They might want to track 12-year sustainment of a job, but if the government is catching 6 months, it might be better to just at least align on that as the next best way to think about it, even if their program only ends on the day they get a job.
Elizabeth, does anyone else want to add anything to this from the panelists?
No, I don't think so. I think that was sufficient. Okay. More interesting to hear from the foundations themselves, really, who are grappling grappling with this real time.
Mm-hmm. We also had a question about how to make impact measurement actionable. And before that question, I think Elizabeth was just talking about, or actually answering that question. So I think that that question has been fully addressed, by the panelists already. So I'm going to just give you like a last opportunity to say a few final words if you have something else that you would like to convey to the audience before we wrap up. Gina?
Yeah, so just thinking about time and long-termness, I think for independent foundations like Esmée, a long-term timescale is the thing that we have, and governments often don't have it, and businesses don't have it, and we really do have it. So in a time of crisis, it is an interesting issue to negotiate. How much are we acting now for things that are kind of coming up right now and needs that are emerging now, and how much are we thinking long-term? So I would say one of the kind of the things that's important to manage if you are involved in learning at a foundation or thinking about impact is to really bear in mind the things that you have learned so far are not to be thrown away. So the things that work, the things that have worked and haven't worked, they're still relevant, and it's important to keep bringing them back even when the temptation is to push everything into crisis management. How much are you going to hang on to the things that don't work from the past, because things hopefully will return to normal and or something like normal, and those issues won't go away. So we're really thinking now about how much do we move our funding towards dealing with crisis, away from sort of early action or prevention, which is always something that we've been thinking about. But as Louise kind of said, particularly in the arts sector in the UK, there is a danger that the whole sector will lots of it will disappear if we don't act now. So there won't be a long term if we don't act now. So I think there are trade-offs, whereas in environment, the long-term issue of climate change is still just as important as ever it was. And it's really important that we keep our kind of view on that. So it might differ according to sectors, but yeah, so it's really interesting. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to all the panelists for sharing your experience and answering the questions as well. I think it's been really interesting for us, for Leonora and myself, but hopefully as well for the audience that has participated in this webinar. I'd also like to mention that we have created a landing page for the study where you'll be able to download the presentation and the webinar recording, the actual study, as well as the executive summary and the case studies. And we'll also be sending out a questionnaire around impact measurement and COVID-19 to all the participants in this webinar. So thank you very much to all the participants who have joined the webinar today. Thanks again to BBK and to our 4 foundations for all your support and all your work on this. And I wish you all a great day and a good summer. Thank you.